Thank you for being here with us this morning to be part of this discussion on a very exciting and intriguing work that has been undertaken by our colleagues from RIA. And I suppose I don't have to explain what RIA is. Hopefully everybody knows. Okay, yes. From your faces, I think everybody knows. But what is important is that last year or the year before, it's a long time now, we decided that it was extremely important to understand the real impact of ASAP programs, because we are being asked by our donors what is our money being used for and what is the real impact of our investments. So through ASAP2, we funded this impact assessment work that is going to be, the results are going to be discussed today regarding adaptation to climate change of the smallholder farmers that we are supporting. So this second phase of ASAP2, as many of you will recall, ASAP1 was about investments, specific climate investments blended to our loans. ASAP2 is for technical assistance and is really to continue helping us mainstreaming climate in our operations, but in a different way. So with ASAP2, we invested in 41 countries, $300 million. The program is running, and hopefully we will have finalized all our projects by 2023. But in the meantime, we are assessing what we are achieving with these $300 million from ASAP1. ASAP2, on the other hand, is being funded, although ASAP1 was funded by 11 donors, ASAP2 is funded only by 2 donors for the time being, Sweden and NORAD, the Norwegian Cooperation Agency. And it's sort of a transition program to be able to provide this technical assistance and help us identify additional sources of funding for climate for our investments. So the project today is very timely because we are in this process of looking for more resources. And we need to demonstrate what we are doing with our climate financing. You know also that part of our commitments on climate with the board during the discussions of the IFAD 11 replenishment was that 25% of our POLG resources of our program of loans and grants will be used for climate-focused investments, and also that we will make sure that the NDCs were taken into account in all our COSOPs. So for those that don't know, NDCs are the national determined contributions agreed in Paris by all member states that agreed to the Paris Agreement. So there are a lot of those NDCs that are related to agriculture, either from the adaptation point of view or the mitigation point of view, and that is why it's so important that IFAD is supporting its implementation. So with what we are trying to do now, some of you know that we are trying to track that climate finance. It's part of our commitments also under IFAD 11. But it's not just tracking climate finance. What we really want is to ensure that all in the future, hopefully closer future, not long-term future, all IFAD investments are really taking into account climate and are able to adapt our investments and ensure its future success. Because if we don't take that into account, of course, we know, at least the majority of the people in this room know that we will fail. So that is why what we are doing is so important. So this project has been designed to support IFAD's role in implementing effective and evidence-based projects in a feedback loop approach. This would be achieved by tapping into the extensive evidence that we think we have generated with ASAP. So with the support of RIA, we are then going to contribute to this knowledge, and we will be ready to share, because of course some of our ASAP donors want to know what are the results, and we need to share with them very soon what is the result of this work. So we are privileged today to be joined by Nancy McCarthy and Gianluca Franceschini, and of course our own Robert Delf, because he's our own, he's our IFAD colleague. And they will be sharing with us, of course, a lot of the work they are doing. Gianluca is a GIS and Earth observation specialist from FAO. And Nancy is the founder of Lead Analytics, which is a consulting firm that specializes in agriculture economics and legal analysis to support economic development. So with that, my clone and I are going to the OSCE. So I'm sorry I have to abandon you because I'm a bit late for OSCE, but I leave you in the very able hands of Romina, who will be running the rest of the meeting. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Margarita. So first of all, thanks for joining this learning event, which I'm very happy we managed to organize. And I don't want to waste too much time before getting into the presentations, but just a short preamble to add to what Margarita has already described, because I think this is a nice collaboration between different departments. As many of you know, in fact, I moved from RIA to ECG, so this is like different pieces of puzzle coming together. But actually this work, this whole idea started back in 2014 when I was still in FAO working on climate smart agriculture. We were working on a project that focused on evidence base for policy making and investment decisions, and particularly focusing on adaptation to climate change. And we realized that there was not that much evidence available out there to support a lot of options that were advocated by FAO itself and many other institutions. So we were working in Malawi, and we came across the SAP, the Sustainable Agricultural Production Program in Malawi, and we thought, wow, this is quite a good opportunity to provide some evidence. This was an IFAD-funded project, which was focusing, Rob will describe that in more detail, focusing on adoption of good agricultural practices. So we talked to Rob and to IFAD to say, can we conduct an impact assessment of this project, because this will provide a richness of evidence and results to the arena of policymakers, development practitioners, researchers, etc. So Rob was on our side. We did have, in this case, quite a good baseline survey. From FAO, we complemented the survey with a community-based survey, and with the climatic georeference data that Gianluca helped us with. Then I moved to IFAD, to the research and impact assessment. So I said, well, what a better opportunity to continue this work and continue with this evidence. And the ASAP2 was like the best opportunity to actually get this job going. And so we continue with a new round of data collection last year. And we are happy today to share with you some results and get feedback from you and from the different expertise that are here, and also from the many people that are connected. So we can get started, and the first one will be Gianluca Franceschini to show us what he did.
Thank you, Romina. Good morning, everybody. So I think that probably Romina already explained why I'm here. I start this collaboration in climate smart agriculture when Romina was there, and also other friends. And I continue to provide support to this activity, basically as a GIS, a remote sensing expert, producing those data and information, and then we're analyzing and will be presented later. So I come from the geospatial unit of the FAO, which is under the Climate, Biodiversity, Land and Water Department, and the acronym is bring some of these words together randomly, quite. But this unit, which changed name many times, it always work on the use of remote sensing data, so satellite data and geospatial application, mainly focused on land, so land cover, land use mapping, agroecological zoning, natural resource assessment, and looking also out on the impact on climate on the people and on the resources that are produced. If you are interested to know about some of the projects that we are doing, we have the link to our geospatial theme that collect not only our work, but also much of the work and the content and projects that the FAO is doing on geospatial. Now, this work started some years ago, but it really seems that was the prehistory of remote sensing and geospatial application. So what changed in 5 years, apart the fact that I'm a bit older? There were three main events that really changed how we are doing our work. So an explosion of data. So even in our normal life, we more and more hear about big data. So big volume of data that became accessible in case of remote sensing, new Earth observation mission, cheaper, easy to launch, and more will come in the next future. So in this, the Europe is leading with these Sentinel missions, and now there are three main satellites, and 3 more will be launched in the next future. So more and more data, optical data, radar data, available for everybody. The second part is artificial intelligence. It's funny that these algorithms actually most of these were developed in the 50s and 60s, but they are perfectly suitable for managing big data, big volume of data. If you have one Excel table, maybe are not needed, but if you have millions of Excel tables, machine learning can really easily detect patterns. Now, how to bring these, the algorithms and the data to the users is through, to access and to download and to process and to store petabyte of information is impossible, but they created the cloud. So a system where store the data centrally, somewhere in the world, but you can access the system with a device, even with a mobile phone, and interact with the system. So in my work that produced the data, so the basic steps were to define the sampling area, so the area of study, in case of Malawi, the enumeration area, to define the data sources that related to not only to climate, but also to other indicators, extract the statistics, and provide some initial analysis, and then further, at the end, just share the result. For the enumeration area, we selected 120 centroid from the villages. It was a bit lengthy because of some problems on find the right coordinates somewhere in the middle in the lake. But then at the end, we managed to fix it, and was just a problem on format of latitude and longitudes. For data sources, we did quite a lot of work on trying to find the right sources. So we download data for rainfall, temperature, elevation data, accessibility. There was a simple analysis looking how these points or villages were remote from the main cities, and DVI in order to have an assessment of the vegetation and understand how the impact of the project in the time, and also some information about soil quality and population. How we access this data and how we extract the statistics through Google Earth Engine, which is one of these cloud systems, so that provide the access to the data, so petabyte of data stored centrally on their computers. The API, that means the algorithms, not only the machine learning, but also simple algorithms to display and show data, charts, etc., within a simple editor online. And then the power. So you are not using one computer. You are using, I think when they came to the FAO, they mentioned they have 60,000 computers in parallel. So a huge power of computers able to interact with this data. And to show you a couple of examples. Oops, sorry, where is the mouse? Okay. So this is just one, oops, sorry. I don't know what happened, so, okay. This is how the editor of Google Earth Engine works. So basically here there is an editor script, and I show the enumeration area with the population data. Now, without downloading the data, we can extract the statistics based on any formula that we decide. So to have, I don't know, average population data in this case within the enumeration area. More interesting than this, I will click directly on the link that I open. This is just one example of one single enumeration area where we selected the CHIRPS data set, and with a matter of really minutes, we can create a time series. In this case, I put it just a couple of years just for the chart. But this happen live, so you can interact with the data. The data are updated, I don't know with frequency, but let's say daily. And you can create statistics of in this case, rainfall in a minute. So in this work, for instance, what we did, oops, let me come back to the PowerPoint. Okay. We produce 300, maybe less days per year for 120 enumeration area, 35 years, more than 1,500,000 data points in a matter of a couple of hours without using our computer. So you can launch the script and get the result after 2 hours or in the morning when you reach the office. This really changed the way how we work in the past, where we had to download the data and do the analysis, run the scripts, etc., etc. So what are the main issues that I can describe from my experience? So first of all, okay, cloud computing is beautiful, but of course, and also allow you non-expert to do statistical analysis. Sometimes this is a bit the limitation because sometimes you require experts at least to understand what you are doing. And talking with the people that came to FAO once, they say, okay, now we are providing the ability to anyone to produce maps. So maybe this is not always good. And also the other big limitation is that, okay, when you start to select and look for the data, you tend to focus on those data that are in the cloud because they are much easier to access. So this can be a limitation because not always the data are available. And the other issue talking about Google Earth Engine is that, of course, it's a private company. So it brings some ethical issues that I don't want to enter now. But for instance, in my work, I support 2 projects, one in Laos and one in Iran. Iran, for instance, they cannot have access to Google Earth Engine because they have the IP blocked. So they find other ways to do it, but in principle, I mean, an FAO member country cannot use this system. The other thing is to understand let's say, the goodness and the quality of climate data is complex. There are many models, many ways to produce this data, from remote sensing, from ground data. To understand which data is better is not easy at all. Probably none of this data is the perfect data. So in order to understand the limitation of data for a specific project is something very complex. For the NDVI analysis that we use for, let's say, evaluating the impact and the changes on the land and overall the quality of the project, also this is something quite complex because without entering in the technical detail, the information that you have from the satellite, yes, it is related to the vegetation, but this relationship is quite complex. It's not always linear. It depends a lot of the quality of the images. That depends at the end of the cleanness of the sky, which change every day, and it depends on the latitude. So to put in relationship these only with the quality of the vegetation is difficult. It's easy when you have massive changes, but in order to understand the degradation or improvement is something that probably it must be set for each specific project, for each specific activity on the land. There are other ways to understand what's happening, but this is really something quite complex. And I think within the time, I completed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianluca. I think we can leave the questions for after all the presentations. So we have understood that as much as we shouldn't self-diagnose using Google, also for GIS-related things, it's better to rely on experts. And I give the floor to Rob to go into the SAP a little bit.
Thank you. Where did you put it, Oliver? Oh. I've messed it up. Sorry. You never trust an agronomist with technology. So I didn't realize you'd done it sequentially. Sorry. So good morning again. So like all good ideas, you need something to be the guinea pig for the implementation of the idea. So Gianluca has talked about how they were looking for somewhere where they could really look at the climate impacts on project implementation. So in those discussions, we came up with the project in Malawi. The map on the left is just showing the 5 districts where the project is. And as you saw from his presentation, there's obviously climatic variation, soil variation. Everything is very within the target area of the project and with time. I'm not going to read through this. I mean, this is a little bit of an old style project for IFAD. It was designed in 2009-10. It's a 9-year project, which is unheard of these days. It doesn't mention value chains. It doesn't mention rural finance. It doesn't really mention climate, to be very honest. It was, as an agronomist, a pure agronomy project. It was about extension advice. It was about access to inputs and services. It was really about increasing crop production. I'm not sure I'll ever see one like this again in my time in IFAD, but I have some hope we will. As with all projects, it started 2012. There was the usual 1-2 year delay in getting going. So the baseline came at the end of 2014, which was perfectly in time for the investigation work from the FAO team. I think one thing that Romina didn't mention, what I was very interested in is, we always talk about having sort of the beneficiary of the project and we have a control group. But when we do our baselines, we sort of randomly select everybody and we don't look at whether the communities and households to be treated, to be project beneficiaries, are actually comparable to where we have the control communities. We just assume that everybody is the same and we don't. So one of the very interesting things I found was that when we did the baseline, we then compared the to be treated communities and the control communities to make sure that they were the same now, and therefore any differences would be possibly attributed to the project in the future. That's really the basic outline. Nancy will talk much more about, obviously, the impact assessment on more specific indicators in a minute. Just looking then very briefly at the structure of the project, 2 components, the third one being project management. Adaptive research was really what we now talk about being research extension linkages. What are the new technologies, the new approaches that can be promoted by the project, linking to national research, international research, and then work in the field. So working with farmers to evaluate the technologies. Knowledge management, very self-explanatory, then documenting that process. The second component was very much then looking at ways of improving the adoption of good agricultural practices. At the same time, as this project was going on, sort of the extension component, and there was and still is a national subsidy program for fertilizer use in Malawi. It's been hugely documented, it's hugely controversial to this day. And part of this project, when it was designed, was actually working through the system-wide program funding for that, but with an aim of moving the subsidies from the public sector to the private sector. So there's a lot of work on support to agri-dealers, another approach is of commercializing in a sustainable way the access to inputs from the program. I'm going to stop there because this is really, as I said, sort of the least interesting part of this morning's session. This is just the project that was then the guinea pig for the broader analysis. So I think I'll stop there and pass to Nancy, or back to Romina, sorry. Okay, thank you.
I just press this?
Yes,
Okay. Can I use this instead of this?
you can.
Is that on?
Yes, should be on.
Hello, testing. Okay, so as Rob said, we'll be looking at the Sustainable Agricultural Production Program in Malawi. And I'd like to say also, with Romina, I was working with Romina and Aslahan and Adriana many years ago in FAO, and I was also involved with the community level data collection way back in 2015. So this has been an interesting journey for me as well. Okay, so for us to do the impact assessment, we start with their theory of change, SAP's theory of change. And then, so as Rob said, the first thing, our first outputs are this improved extension advice and greater access to markets. So then we have these intermediate outcomes, and these are what we're really going to look at today because it's a midline. And we expect this is where we're going to see the most impacts at this time. And these are the good agricultural practices, which I'll define later on down the road. We will look at a few of the outcomes and potential impact variables as well. But we do want to say, but this is still midline, and we expect to have bigger impacts a little bit more further down the road. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So as we said, so we have the treatment status was at the district level. So this is quite a coarse level to be able to handle the differences between treatment and control areas. But as Rob said, they did a really good job at finding these matching districts and finding households that looked quite similar across the treatment and control areas. And it was a large survey. We had 1,800 households at baseline. And from the baseline, we could find 1,656 at midline. This is about an 8% attrition, which over that many years is actually pretty good in Malawi because our households in Malawi are very peripatetic. They get up and move all the time. So 8% attrition is quite good, and it was similar across treatment and controls. So that was also really good for us. And as Gianluca was saying, we also have 120 communities, and we have the community surveys for those 120. And I want to, so for an impact assessment of this nature, it's really critical to pick up at the community level the other projects that have been operational in these communities over time. And so we have the information operational since 2010. So, IFAD projects or anybody else's projects may not be the only game in town, and it's really critical to be able to control for those when you're doing your impact assessment. Okay, so the key variables of interest is, of course, the SAP treatment, okay? And we want to know if this leads to also not just higher yields, for instance, or value of production per hectare, but also stability. So we want both for climate resilience, not just higher, but also more stable. So those are critical. Did I skip a slide? I think I might have. No, I didn't. Oh, I got rid of it. So we have, not only is it SAP, but as we're talking about, we also are concerned about the climate and weather variables. For this particular talk, and we've looked at a lot of different really interesting other factors, but here we're going to focus on what was the impact of long-term climate on the adoption of good agricultural practices. And then in terms of outcomes, crop outcomes, we'll look at weather shocks. How do these affect our outcomes, and are they mediated by being involved in the SAP project? So for gap adoption, we're going to look at the long-term average flowering season rainfall. We're going to look at the coefficient of variation of rainfall, both above the mean and below the mean, to capture expected or probability of shocks, excessive rainfall shocks for high, and for the expectations of low rainfall or probability of receiving a low rainfall shock. And we'll also look at the average number of days during the flowering season where maximum temperatures exceed 35 degrees. So that would be a temperature shock. So that's what we're trying to get: rainfall, temperature shocks, and then long-term averages. For crop production outcomes and some of our food security outcomes, we're going to, instead of only looking at just the climate variables, we're also going to look at what actually happened in that past season. So we're looking at deviations from actual rainfall, and does that predict how well you do? And we're going to split this as well. So do high rainfall shocks have a different impact than low rainfall shocks? In our particular case, what happened in 2018 is it was for many parts of our population, it was a drought year. So we don't actually observe much in the way of a high rainfall shock, but we have a large percentage of people who did suffer a pretty severe drought shock. Okay. So we also, in addition to just the percent deviation, which is going to capture a linear impact of these deviations on crop production outcomes, we also include a drought dummy to see, okay, so as the deviation gets lower, I'm falling, but is there a threshold point where I'm really going to drop? And so we're going to put in a dummy following the agronomic literature for, this is a 33% below the mean rainfall realization to capture this potential nonlinear impacts of a drought. And we're also going to include the current season's number of flowering seasons with very high temperatures. And then our key variable, of course, is going to be the SAP interaction term. So SAP times a drought shock, do you do better or worse? So if SAP variable itself is positive, then that means on average SAP is raising production. And then we're looking at the interaction term, then says, and are you doing it also under a drought shock? So we can, now I want to walk over to it. So these are the main hypotheses that we're looking at across our variables of interest. So we expect SAP treatment to have a positive impact on GAPS adoption, on crop production, and food security. We include long-term average rainfall, which is ambiguous because certain good agricultural practices perform better in areas that are subject to high rainfall and others in low rainfall, so that's ambiguous. It could be positive or negative. But the average number of high temperatures, we expect that to give greater incentives to adopt good agricultural production practices. And again, the higher rainfall variability, the more shocks you may receive, this is a reason to adopt these good agricultural practices. And then when we look at the current period weather, the actual number of high temperature days should, and greater, the drought dummy, we should have lower crop production and lower food security impacts, but we expect it to be mitigated by SAP. So SAP times the drought dummy should lead to higher. So our results. So we can see, and these are just a few of the good agricultural practices, but for time reasons, and these are pretty key ones, I've given this hyphenated list. So we see that SAP has had a positive impact on the adoption of minimum tillage, cover crops, legume intercrops, box ridges, and then we also created an index just for all of the different gaps, and it's positive for all of the gaps. And so in some cases, there was no impact, but there was never a negative impact. So it was either positive or neutral. And we see that what's really driving the adoption of GAPS is average rainfall. So in lower rainfall regions, this is where people are really adopting these GAPS. But when we look at the average number of high temperature days, that only, which we would think would really promote the adoption of GAPS, we see it's only positive for cover crops. And indeed, it's negative for legumes, legume intercrops, and box ridges. And that means that the GAP index itself is actually lower when you have more frequent high temperature shocks. And we don't like to see that, and we'll have to see how that actually translates into the crop production impacts. The long-term understandings of the probability of getting either a drought or an excessive rainfall or flood shock have no influence on the adoption of GAPs themselves. So farmers are not really adopting as a function of the variability they see, but rather the low rainfall. If I'm in a low rainfall area, I will adopt, but not necessarily if I'm more or less subject to droughts or floods. So that's also an interesting result. So our crop production and food security results. So we see that SAP has no impact on maize yields, on whether or not there's adequate food consumption or food expenditure per capita. And again, especially for these longer term measures, we weren't really expecting a SAP impact, but we put them in because we do want to explore these climate and weather impacts so that we know what to expect in the future. So what we see is the number of high temperature days is negative and significant in every case. And we've tried this with many other indicators as well, different crop production, value of hectares, staples. It is always strongly negative and significant across all crop production, all consumption measures you could possibly think of. The drought dummy is negative as well across the board, except for the values of staples per hectare, which I'll discuss next. So they really are not protected against shocks, right? And these rainfall impacts. So whatever the production practices that are in place right now, they are still really exposed and not able to moderate or mitigate the effects of these droughts. So what we have is a very positive impact of SAP on value of staples per hectare, but it's negative, the SAP times drought variable, which means that they were not doing as well in the drought areas. In the non-drought areas, SAP farmers, fabulous, but in the drought areas, they fell back a bit. Okay, and so, but on the other hand, there is a positive impact on adequate food consumption from the SAP program. That's something that we have to work through to figure out exactly how that mechanism occurred. So what we see is that we do expect gaps to be higher in areas more exposed to temperature and drought and rainfall shocks of any level, but only cover crops are higher in these areas more exposed to, and that in particular is a temperature shock. And the legumes, again, it can't be stressed too much, these are not responding to your likelihood of being shocked, but that's where they should give the biggest value. That's where they should do the best. But it's not something that's driving people to do this. And indeed, the variability is quite limited impact on gaps. The really big mystery here was why was the SAP times drought impact negative? In maize, and one of the, I should have said, so for the SAP project, maize is such a dominant crop in Malawi, and many projects try and help farmers diversify outside of being like strictly maize producers. And in the SAP project, that really is through legumes, and that there's a big emphasis because legumes are supposed to give you this benefit, especially under heat and drought stress. So I'll just go to the next slide. We had to dig into this a little bit, and we haven't, it's still a mystery. But one of the things we did find was that in areas with a drought for both treatment and controls, 18% of the farmers, SAP farmers, grew pigeon pea. But only 1% of controls grew pigeon pea. So now you've got a really strong correlation between SAP and pigeon pea in drought areas. And the pigeon pea yield declined more than 50%. It declined more than maize. And also the price of pigeon pea kind of fell. So altogether, most of the story of this negative impact seems to have come through the pigeon peas, and we don't know exactly why the pigeon peas didn't perform. And we have also other data, right? We have the LSMS data, the Malawi LSMS data, also a drought year in 2016, and the pigeon pea yields did not fall as far. So we did a little experiment. We gave our SAP farmers the yields that the LSMS farmers received under a drought, and then they would, not only would there have been a positive impact on SAP direct effect, it also would have been positive for the shock. So SAP times shock would have been positive. So this is something, and I looked into a lot of different explanations, like was there a pod borer outbreak, or did the goats eat them? And because it was a drought year, so goats was a big concern. I mean, were they going in and getting the pigeon pea? It's a problem with pigeon pea in Malawi that the goats do eat it. But there's no correlation between the number of goats in a community and the loss of pigeon pea. So we have been pursuing this down, and we just haven't gotten to it yet. So this leaves a mystery, and I think it leaves a big mystery for the project, because we really think that legumes are important. Most other extant information supports that legumes should be more heat and drought tolerant, and therefore help under climate change that's going to bring these more extremes. But it just wasn't the case here. So as we have. So the concluding comments are that SAP is doing a really good job at promoting these gaps. I've looked at other projects, I've worked on other projects trying to promote these types of sustainable land management techniques, and these are really good results relative to other projects that I've seen in terms of the uptake of these practices. We have to still be concerned with especially these high temperature shocks, which are just so dominant, negative impact on all crop and consumption outcomes. And again, the fact that there's still there's no link between these potentials for being shocked and SAP adoption. So that's something that the SAP team can really take on board to help farmers be concerned not just about average realizations, but if you're in a highly variable area, these can give benefits, except for maybe not pigeon pea. But so again, you can see I was obsessed with the pigeon pea story, because now I've got like the 35th slide on pigeon pea. We really have to figure out what's going on with that. But altogether, then also, and the SAP project, it has to be said, so they went through their midterm review, and they took on board a lot of the recommendations. They changed, they looked at different options. So, you know, they kind of moved away from, say, conservation agriculture, because that was one of the things that was not being adopted, and that people were showing, demanding different types of gaps. And maybe here it would be useful to think about a wider range of potential gaps, and those that explicitly deal with heat tolerance, because that is by far the most dominant negative impact is through that, and maybe, for instance, heat tolerant varieties or other things that are directly addressing these heat impacts. And then I'm going to leave it with two additional things. Like I said, we looked at a number of other variables and factors that affected how well SAP was reaching out to farmers. But probably one of the most critical ones is coming back to these. We can control for the number of agricultural focused interventions operating since 2010, and non-agriculture as well. But of relevance here is the fact that there's no impact of having previous projects, agricultural focused projects, on any crop outcomes. So those projects came, they might have done a good job then. We have no evidence of any surviving positive impacts. And we also know, actually, with gaps, there's a lot of adoption and disadoption. And so we have to be concerned, and this is going to be really critical for Endline to take into consideration. And so those two things, I think, and SAP is already thinking about how do we successfully exit, how do we close down and make sure that these impacts, that we do have the positive impacts, outlive the life of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I think that was very interesting, and we had a good overview of all the different steps that led us to these results. As she mentioned, there are also many other results that we can also discuss a little bit, which we didn't present here today. But before I take the opportunity to ask two questions to the panel, I'd like to first open the floor very briefly. Do you want to jump in here, because that's
sure. We have 12 people online following this event. If they wish to submit a question, you can go to slido.com, and there is a field where you can insert IFAD, and then you will come to a page, and there will be another window where you can write down a question and your name, and it will pop up on my screen here, and we will address your question. So to the 12 people online, please go to slido.com and submit your questions. Thank you.
Okay, this was the bits that Oliver couldn't resist to. So should I first open the floor for just clarification, questions for clarification, just briefly, and then we go maybe into more insightful and discussion and implications. How many minutes can I give Oliver for clarifications?
5.
5? It's even too much. Okay. Any questions for clarification to the floor?
So it's not question and answer session?
No. If there is something you didn't understand, no. No, okay. So before we open the floor, I'd like to ask a question to Nancy and one to Rob, that are more for because what we'd like to see is also how can we use the results of these studies for IFADs, and how IFAD can improve its operation and implementation of projects. So, as I said, we also did other studies. So, if you don't mind, Nancy, I'd like to ask you if you can describe also a little bit what are the drivers of adoption of the GAP, because we also looked into that.
Yeah, so like we said, in this seminar, we were just looking at climate, but we looked at a wide range of other drivers, including labor constraints, cash constraints, education or knowledge, understanding constraints, whether or not they were reaching female farmers or younger household farmers. And what we found, which is a really good result, is that actually SAP is reaching all of those, that the adoption is not being hindered by being poor, not having cash, or being a female-headed household, or being, so that they seem to be good for those characteristics. The biggest factor, the biggest constraint is land size and other agricultural implements. So if they can't be productive because they have limited land and hardly any implements, there's not very many incentives to adopt the gaps. But that's really the only constraint. But that's also a really interesting, both of those things that you are reaching, that female-headed households, those who not necessarily have a lot of cash on hand, they can still adopt these gaps. So that's just some of the other interesting.
That's good. So we're doing a good job with targeting and mainstreaming for not just climate, but also for the social inclusion. Right. And we also interacted quite a bit with the CPM and team, also at the stage where they were doing the annual survey and the monitoring. So on a more general level, Rob, what lessons can be learned for the design and for the implementation and monitoring of projects? And I'm asking that to you, but I see there's also Rike here and other FAO colleagues that can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is the big question.
That's why I'm asking to you.
No, I mean it's. I mean, I guess it. Looking at why RIA was created was to get a better idea of what impact we're having on the projects that we're funding. And I think Nancy's last conclusion was that it doesn't matter how many projects you have in a community, they're still not adopting technologies. And I think part of that is we don't know enough about decision making at farmers level. So I think it's a little bit linked to access to information. So whilst they know climate is changing, do they really know what is it that's changing? Or do they just think it's just drought? When actually, in essence, it may be that the higher temperatures are affecting the flowering of the crops and therefore they're getting lower yields. But this is something that's very hard to perceive compared to a storm or a drought. So I think the sort of analysis that Jean-Luc presented is, we sort of now, I said originally this was an old style project. We didn't think about these things in 2009 and 10. But now we do the SECAP, and I think part of it is what additional modeling should we do at cost-up stage or design stage to really try to link to these existing data sets and say what is the factor that's affecting production, I'm going to go on a mist, production at the moment. And then you link that to what can farmers do about it given their land size, their financial access to rural finance. So I think it's, for me, it's doing a little bit more the broader analysis at design to really understand, is it really drought that's the issue? Is it urbanization? Is it land size? Is it other climatic factors? And how does that help us inform the projects? Luckily, the next design mission for SAP is in June, and the agronomy team will be on that mission. So these sort of findings are very useful to follow into what you do for the next year, 2 or 3 years of management. But at the same time, we're designing new projects in Zambia and in Malawi. And how do we get the lessons from this sort of analysis into these other projects? In IFAD, we're not very good at doing that yet. So that's something we have to work on, is how to maybe come up with some guidance. I know, not OPR type guidance, but the format and environment. But what is it that we should think about with design teams? Sorry, OPR, if you're here. For design teams, that these are the things they should be looking for data at cost-up and design stage, that they can then be thinking a bit more about what potential impacts they should be addressing in design. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rika, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think it's very interesting, but I think one of the basic problems we will have in IFAD, and where Rob also started to say, is we don't build the control group. That's I learned trying to work with Ria on resilience monitoring. We don't do that. So many times we'll not even be able to do this type of analysis to learn more. So I think with Ria, we need really to have your knowledge and your guidance early on even in the end of the design, but also especially at project startup where these baseline studies are launched, because we do actually spend a lot of money on it. And it is a bit controversial because us project designers, we are a little bit like, and we also support the implementation, you cannot say this village we will never support. I mean, we have a problem with that. We have an ethical problem with that because the government would know, and these projects are very long, and why can you just exclude whole villages? Or, I don't know. So I think this issue, we have to work on it, because if we don't have the control group, can we really do these kind of analysis? And if not, we need to work on it. So I think this is one thing we have to do together. From my perspective, I've worked a lot on resilience monitoring. How can we do it? I'm very interested in tools that our countries can pick up and use themselves. Because at the end of the day, IFAD needs to learn. We need to report back to our donors. For me, most important, the countries need to learn. What can they do better? And if they're not involved in these impact assessment as almost them applying the tools and monitoring it, I'm afraid that linkage doesn't happen. So this has been my mission a little bit, creating a resilience monitoring tool that the PMUs can use. And you not need an external consultant to come in and do it. So yeah, but that's another type of challenge because, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Rika. Yeah, I think the monitoring is certainly quite important, and we certainly can work better at the baseline. But in terms of what Rob raised on the SECAP and the analysis that we should be doing ahead of time, I'm seeing a lot of improvement is being made. Of course, we need to do more, but at least we are walking towards that direction. Asli, I know you cannot resist. You cannot wait any longer, so please go ahead with your question.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for the presentations and for the intervention. Maybe I'll follow up on your comment just immediately, then, and I have a question, I think, to Nancy. In terms of the design and the control group, the problem that you mentioned, the ethical problem the governments have, it's obvious to everyone, I think, in this room. And it's an old problem, actually. I mean, we, as economists, we have addressed that like long time ago. So you don't have to deprive like entire villages from an intervention. And also looking at the nature of intervention anyway, you know, you can't start everything at the same time in any case. So you just do a randomized phase in that addresses your question already. And that's an easy fix. I mean, if that's the only problem that we have with the governments in terms of kind of being able to keep a control, clean control for a certain amount of time until you get your logistics ready, and then you do the phase in startup anyway, then that should actually help us already a lot. So that's not a problem that cannot be solved, at least. In terms of the agronomy-based interventions like ASAP, you mentioned yourself, it's an old style. It doesn't even mention value chain. It doesn't mention you know, climate change adaptation or mitigation, all those things that we all have mainstream now. So I'm wondering, actually, the lessons that we're learning from here, for example, in terms of drought and temperature variability over time, and then communicating this to farmers. For IFAD going forward, I think it's going to be really hard to continue doing stuff like this, right? Just really focusing on one big main staple and increasing productivity. So there's going to be always the value chain and the processing and marketing, producer groups, and everything else, you know, that we have to take care of now. So the interesting thing, I think, would be to think about, okay, so if we're designing new projects with all these different components now, how can we use the information, like the geospatial information, combine it in places where staples are really important, but also look at the, you know, the beyond the farm gate somehow to be able to assess these climate change adaptation of our interventions as a total. And just finally, Nancy, I was just wondering, you mentioned the disadoption at the end. We've worked on it together for years. I was wondering whether you guys have looked at just quickly on the disadoption just until now, from the beginning until the midline, and how are those adoption-disadoption dynamics looking on the field? Thanks.
Okay, so now I'm going to have to remember this off the top of my head, and so I'm not going to say for sure. So as you know, like at baseline, there were, say, 50% of households already did crop rotation, and then it goes down to maybe 17% did some kind of box, ridges, contours, or something like that, and then down to, say, 2% did minimum soil disturbance, right? So most things over time in the control group went down. So there was more disadoption in the control group, and they went up in the SAP. All right, so, but that disadoption that we observe all the time are people, so now we're talking about people did adopt and disadopt in the control group, right? So they did both. But there was more, the disadoption overwhelmed adoption in the control group, which is what we're talking about when we see that, yeah. Nothing like what we saw in Zambia, but still quite a lot of disadoption.
Rob, do you want to?
I think it's more a comment for me
Yeah.
than a question. I think this is the big issue. Is we've moved a long way in how we try to link the climate adaptation to the SECAP to then informing the design of the project. I think this shows that there's potentially a few more steps that we could take, bringing in some of these spatial analysis tools and long-term data sets, and the ease that we can now crunch large amounts of data. I think that's what Jean-Luc was saying. It's not a, you know, you don't need to have supercomputers anymore to do this. You can do it with Google Engine and GeoNode, and we're having those sort of things starting in IFAD now. So I think this is what's really interesting. The question is always, what are the questions you want to ask of that data?
Right, yeah.
And that comes from the impact assessments you do to say, okay, well, actually, it's temperature that's the issue, and it's a perception that the problem that farmers have is drought. So these are where it becomes very interesting, these two things.
Perhaps ensuring that the lessons learned are brought in future project design is one big step to achieve better results and better targeting, and using maybe also the GIS that I think there are some people keen here on pushing forwards. I see, in fact, some hands raised. Eric? Wait, you need to wait for the microphone.
Yeah, thanks. So on that, picking up on Rob's point there, let me ask an irreverent question. So, I mean, I'm wondering if we're asking the wrong question. Because, I mean, with the World Bank, they came up with this idea of absorptive capacity. And so for me, it was always a problem for the bank, but it was externalized onto the borrowing countries. They can't absorb the capital that we need to lend to keep our business model going. Could this be similar? Could we be asking the wrong questions? So maybe the problem is not a lack of adoption of these gaps. Maybe these gaps are good in and of themselves, but there might be a lot of other factors, a lot of other problems, a lot of other priorities that could be, explaining, the project. Maybe there could be successes in the project that we don't see because we're measuring the wrong thing. So could our evaluation criteria be too narrow? And there was a comment earlier, there were lots of other things that we studied, and that was briefly mentioned. So I'd like to hear a bit more about maybe some of the other aspects of the project, and do they, tell a different story or a nuanced story? Thanks.
Well, I'll take it back to you, but actually, it wasn't mentioned in detail because the focus here was more on climate, but actually the adoption here is quite good. So, but Nancy, you may want to elaborate further on that.
Yeah, and also this is midline as well. So we see the more impacts on the crop production. We've looked at a wide range of crop production, and not just average yields, but also the probability of falling below minimum yields. So we're trying to probe stability that way in a number of ways, right? So both, is it higher but more stable for crop production? And a number of different impacts, but again, the impacts are way down the road. We wouldn't expect to see these. So we have the food consumption score, we have the FIES, what is that, FIES?
Food insecurity experience scale.
So we have that, we have the food consumption per capita, we have total expenditures per capita, we have a wide range, we have the percentage of school children who are enrolled in school, we have a wide range. They're just not a part of this particular presentation.
But they are in the report, Eric. Sebastian and Giancarlo?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just wondering, because this disconnection between the rate of adoption of the techniques promoted by the project and the patterns of a rainfall season is interesting, it's strange. Did you have the opportunity to perhaps compare this study with another success story in Malawi, which is the introduction of fertilizers trees within the maize production system, the evergreen, the evergreen agriculture program has documented very well this thing. Have they made studies with the drivers of the adoption of this kind of sustainable agricultural practices? Is there a connection in that case? Did you manage to make some comparisons?
Do we want to collect some more questions before? There's also Giancarlo that raised them.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting, and I am not really an expert in adoption, but I saw in my experience in Africa a lot of this case where the project finish and everything is forget. So it's not the first example, as you know better than me. I would have some inputs and something to discuss with you about how do you use the indicator, the parameters, indicators, the seasons to evaluate the impacts, because there are some changes. Well, just highlight that 2016 is a really terrible year. So probably is not the right year to compare, because it was the strongest Niño in the history, and it affects everything in Southern Africa. So maybe the adoptions, the practice can work when you have light droughts, but that one was really terrible. So I'm sorry, 2016. The dry year in Southern Africa was very strong. No, I know that, but why? The Niño events in Southern Africa.
No, but why?
This was 2018.
But in your analysis, you have also the 2016 year.
No,
I know it's just.
Compare the results formed in 2016.
Please use the mic, Nancy.
Okay, no,
Sorry.
these are technical stuff.
Not that wasn't for this particular. Here it's 2014 and 2018.
Okay, it's compared the 2 years,
Yes.
the 14 with the 18.
Yeah.
Just compare 2 years. I was thinking to the time series. You compare the
No.
full time series because this is also something that if you compare a specific year can be a little bit more difficult to see some tendencies. I was thinking the full time series including very strong drought
Yeah.
events.
We
That's all.
did, we did have
I
some
would kill
specific
for that
analysis.
data.
Adriana, there's also Florent and Neha.
Hi, thank you. It's a very interesting conversation and presentation. I hope we'll have more of this actually and more of the impact assessments so that we can discuss like real data. I have a couple of very technical questions, and I don't know if anyone wants to hear them. It's especially on this question of the way you define the drought with like 33% below the mean, which I think is fine in a statistical perspective, but it can be a bit problematic in an agronomic perspective in the sense that the optimum of a crop, let's say maize, can be different with respect to the current climate of the area than it is, for example, for tomato, than it is for onions, or it is for whatever you're growing. So by defining 33% as a drought, you somehow create some kind of a bias in the econometric analysis. That's my first question. My second question is on the interaction between temperature and precipitation. You might see through evaporation, or evapotranspiration, sorry, something which is not a drought. So let's say it's below 20%, at the same time as you have something which is just at 34 degrees, but it shows like very high evapotranspiration for a very limited amount of water on the ground, and it could have a negative effect on your production. But you do not see, and you have some kind of like false positive or false negative into your net. And so this was my two very technical questions. And now, like, what I really like about the project in Malawi, and I think I'm very new to IFAD. I've only been here for 2 years. It's simple. There is some kind of simplicity to it, and it's beautiful, actually. You have two things: you want to learn, and then you want to implement. And you know, we have this approach of like doing value chains everywhere without knowing what we need to address in the value chain. And so we do from top to bottom, like from the production to the market to the harbor to whoever is going to consume it in Europe or wherever. And in the end, like the way our ability to address the tipping point in this value chain, which is really going to make the value chain tip into something like sustainable, is not addressed because we do everything. And I think it's a bit of a call to RIA. What I'm saying here is we need to better understand what's happening in the value chains. We need to better understand if it's a problem with the temperature of the production, if it's something with a transportation system, if it's something with the processing and so on. Where do we target our interventions? Because if we have simplicity here, it's thanks to the fact that we understand what is the problem. There is a problem with the extensions. And if we could do more of this stuff in the project, that would be super, super useful.
Thank you, Florent. Shall we answer these first and then we go for another round?
So we have in the paper we've written up a pretty rich literature review on the other studies that have been done on the drivers of adoption of these good agricultural practices, to which we compare our results in the end. So hopefully the paper has, and if you have any more for us to put in, that would be great. We did have, I'm sorry, I was confused. To probe the pigeon pea story a little further, so our story is in 2018, and there was a decent drought in 2018. I don't think decent's the right word, but there was. But we do also have the LSMS data set, and I just wanted to see what happened to pigeon pea in that super drought year in the World Bank data set, and they didn't fall as much. The yields held up. I mean, they held up pretty well, and it was just for me to try and triangulate, try and understand a little bit more why I observe what I observe. So I'm sorry I was confusing that way. This is something, what do we use, how do we account for possible non-linearities of either drought or temperature shocks is something that Romina and I have discussed many times. And I totally agree that at this moment, we either pull ad hoc specifications from somebody else or we come up with our own ad hoc specification. And as far as I see out there, there's very limited, well-justified breaking points. In Malawi, I'm not so concerned because it is maize dominant and there's a lot more work on that. So in other environments, though, I'd be far more concerned about it. And of course, we did perform a lot of sensitivity analysis around our choices. But the other thing is, so this with Gianluca, to help us explore these different data sets that could give us better information. For instance, using the SPEI, so the precipitation and standardized precipitation and evapotranspiration index, and compare that to our rainfall estimates from ARC2 or from CHIRPS or these other sources that we're trying to control for the realizations that we had. But yeah, it really needs to be subject to a lot of sensitivity analysis still. Thank you.
No, I think that the problem is in where do you stop? I mean, you can use generic crop models to pick a few key parameters, whether it's minimum water, maximum temperature, or you can use the data we have now and go to every village and do a soil typology and do a rainfall analysis and do different crop models. It's endless what you can do now. And the more these guys come up with all these cool algorithms and more data sets, you can subdivide everything into the minutiae. And at some point, you've got to stop somewhere, yeah? And we discussed a pigeon pea question. I have no idea why pigeon peas is my favorite crop. I love it. It's drought tolerant. It could be perennial. Goats love it. It has leaves where other crops don't. I mean, it's just a very nice crop. So why in a drought year it performs worse, I have no idea. And I think it's to do more with externalities, which is about the farmer decision making. So if the price has gone down because the Indians aren't importing so much, and farmers know this, they probably planted less or didn't manage it well. But how much can you capture in these analyses? It's really impossible. And it goes back a bit to Eric's question as well, is what is the right question? I mean, I'm an agronomist. I worry about two things, water and finance. If you don't have that, you're not growing anything. You're not investing. It's not about the soil and the seed and the variety. And the challenge when you come to something like Malawi is they have one season a year. So our data is limited anyway. They have a very traditional ridged maize production system, and they prepare the ridges at the first rains. They're not looking at climate information that says this is going to be a good season. And they're not going to go and buy different maize because they saved the seed from last year's crop. So they're already making decisions that affect their ability to respond to information that we can provide through the project and through modeling or through what Tiffany's doing on climatic information for farmers. And by the time they get to make a decision, it's often too late because they don't have the flexibility to make the investment to change what they plan to do because they're constrained. So whilst we can do these studies to follow the panel data, and we really should do more in IFAD, and in fact you go back to the same farmers year on year or every 2 years and follow what really happens, gives us a huge data set to look at. And of course you get 101 questions very quickly, and then trying to pick through that to see what is really the issue, I think is a challenge we have. And IFAD is not very academic. So it's good that we have the partners from FEO and from WFP and from others, from universities and stuff, where I think we have to do a lot more work on this in the future.
Maybe if I can just comment on following what you said. Okay, the benefit of remote sensing data is that the satellites are there, they collect information every day, there will be more satellite and more data with more able to detect specific characteristics of the land, on the water, of the atmosphere and climate. So I hope that my presentation didn't put the message that these data are too complex or very complex to be analyzed. There are people that have the expertise to provide the data, and now we have the technology to interact with the data very easily. The other critical piece is to have the ground information, to have the field data, the socioeconomic data that allow these satellite data to be understood and to be calibrated. And these are always, let's say, goes in parallel pattern where you have more socioeconomic experts that collect field data, questionnaires, and remote sensing experts. There are two different domains, but the real advantage is to be able to use those data, your data, with the remote sensing data. This really brings the real advantage. And it's very important on this to have a proper sample design, proper certification, because then you can analyze the data, use the remote sensing, which are cover the whole land, they are continuous every day, and then you can really understand how, and even understand why your pigeon pea is decreasing.
Thank you. I think we have a couple more questions, one from Neha. One from Adu. Okay.
Perhaps this should have been asked in the clarification section, but just to follow up on Nancy's point earlier about differentiating between some of the gaps and heat-tolerant practices. For us who do not have an agronomics background, going back to the theory of change, actually, is there actually a big difference between the practices that were highlighted on the screen over there and those that would specifically be most suitable in a drought environment? And then I guess perhaps a comment similar to Laurence over there about pigeon pea. I mean, we know legumes are always touted as really good in drought environments. They're semi-arid crops. And again, I don't know the answer to this. Maybe someone could shed light. 33% seems like a lot. But when we talk sort of generically about it being drought tolerant, how does that compare to that number? Is that actually in relation to this 33% number? Or is that just so far out of the water that, maybe the drought tolerance exceeds itself?
Thank you. Arthur also? Then I think we have to close, right?
Thank you. Really great presentation. I just wanted to say on a technical note, I think she said she did do a lot of sensitivity analysis, and perhaps even on that 33%, you can actually vary that and see if there's any changes. A separate issue which has to do with the finding, which I thought was interesting. You find that there's an impact on food security, but not on the value of, output marketed. And I guess one aspect there might have to do with what Rob is talking about, the way these people make decisions. At least my understanding of Malawi, where I lived for 3 years, is you do have really small-scale farmers who are primarily subsistence farmers, and maybe their decisions are really centered on making sure they have enough food. And I think some of these things may be the reason why we find these kind of results. Going to the pigeon pea story, again, it may be that the purpose of planting it may not have had to do with, necessarily getting the most out of it, but people do use it for other things, right? Partly consumption, which is increasing as far as I know, and also it does a great deal in terms of nutrition of the soil for the maize, which is their primary crop. So even if maybe the yields went down, maybe they were focusing on, the maize. And yeah, they knew the market had crashed in India a year or two ago. So they focused on the maize. So I think, trying to attribute all these things necessarily to the project, it may be a bit, I think, far-fetched, because there's so many other things, right, that we're not capturing, the so-called unobservables, that we're not capturing in this. So I would not necessarily see this as saying, oh, the project was not effective, but just like you said, we don't understand enough of this context.
Just very briefly, because we have to close and then give the floor to Sarah. If you want to briefly get back to those questions. And in the meantime, I take the opportunity to thank you all for coming. It was a very interesting session. And thank also to Adriana and Oliver for helping organize this learning event. So if you want to provide a few comments, and then we'll give the floor to Sarah.
Okay. Well, you know, with a panel data set, that we are okay with our fixed effects. So you're really talking about time varying variables, and well, that's always going to be a problem, and I don't find that hugely compelling. But and the other thing is here, why only sap farmers in drought areas? Why not all farmers facing those problems? Why didn't all farmers face the lower price? They did, right? And it's only sap in drought in 2018. It's not treatment and control in 2013. It's not treatment and control in non-drought areas. It's only sap in drought areas. And all of the explanations you gave should have pertained to everyone across both time periods. Right? So we have to be careful when we're thinking about, it's not everything is complicated always for everyone. If it is, then this subgroup should be the same as every other subgroup. Right? So a little bit more careful there. Yeah, and yes, I think that the weakest part of the analysis so far is trying to control for these nonlinear impacts of the drought. And that needs to be probed much further, the 33% would, in that particular case.
Yeah, I mean, two things. First, to your question on, are the gaps that are being promoted the right ones? I mean, this is where you use the analysis for management, which is something else we're not very strong at in IFAD. We tend to follow the project document religiously, and you repeat the numbers of the next activity that's in the next column in the annual work plan and budget. Because a lot of the gaps being promoted were about reducing labor, they were about inputs, they weren't about, damn, it's getting hotter and things aren't growing as well. So then the question becomes, what should the project be promoting in the next few seasons? It's a brilliant question, and that is the question for the mission coming up in June, ahead of this planting season in the next October, November. So that's how we're supposed to. That's how we want to use this sort of analysis, is to say this is an issue that's come up. It wasn't written in 2010 when we wrote the document, and we have to change what we're doing in the next season. So that's how we use that. I think the whole pigeon pea discussion is a proxy for anything. You know, if you adopt conservation agriculture, we'll give you fertilizer on credit. I mean, these are all these things that are being published, and I expect somewhere we'll find out that the project said to their beneficiary farmers that the pigeon peas are a great market, the Indians are importing lots, the price has gone up, we've got this link with NASFARM, they're buying tons of it. And the pigeon pea was there, and by the time the price, I mean, you can argue about this later with me, Nancy, by the time the price wasn't there, they've abandoned the crop. It's a classic disadoption scenario, I think. So you could apply that to anything. I think this is, again, why you do the analysis. What is happening that doesn't make sense? And then you have to understand that to make sense of what to do next. So and
the end line will give us some more answers to that.
Well, yes, but we need to use the results now.
Yeah, of course.
Because, you know, one of Nancy's other big results was on maize yields not increasing. The number one indicator for impact for the project is that maize yields go up from 1.3 tons to 3 tons. So end line, they're going to go, damn guys, you haven't done anything. You haven't achieved your number one indicator. So we need to do something about that now to see what it is that's stopping that, or change the indicators, which we can also do. No, because you have to reflect on what's. No.
They do. You know there was.
Yes, change it. Why not?
We can discuss more what we can do next. Now I think we need to close, right?
Sorry.
Gianluca, do you want to say a few words? Sarah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, guys.
Okay, thank you everybody, and I'm making the most difficult part because the closing remarks are the most boring part of a presentation. Everybody's tired, you're on time constraint, you want to go back to your office and answer to the email, and you heard interesting presentation, and you need to hear more. So what can I say? First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge and to thank the organizer and the fantastic speakers, because this was a huge work. And thanking people and thanking the organizer and the speakers for all the work they put over time, and it's never enough, so it should be formally done. And in particular for the organizer, I would like to thank Romina and Adriana and Oliver in particular for putting together this nice room of people from a different background. I don't see only familiar faces, namely the RIA staff. I'm new, so I may not know all of you. I see other people, and I would like to thank also the country office and the hubs who are, colleagues from the country office and the hubs who are connected. And it's important to have a variety of individuals. It's important to have a variety of individuals. Why? Because this project in particular, and I'm very sad, didn't have the opportunity to attend from the beginning, but I was in other meeting. This project put together, closed the so-called communication gap, not only from the technical point of view, but also from the policy point of view. From the technical point of view, it's important. The Malawi project represents an opportunity to put together the results from the analytical work with the MME and also with how the GIS data can help design impact assessment, produce results, and look at the MME monitoring and evaluation. This is from the technical point of view. From the political point of view, this project has viewed the interaction between different divisions, RIA, PMI, academics, lead experts like Nancy, just to cite one, and also FAO. So, there was a collaboration between institutions. And this was also very, very important. And then I only wanted to highlight two things that were mentioned during the comments, and they were already very important comments. And the first one was lessons learned for future design. That's what we're trying to do in RIA. We're trying to use the lessons learned. In particular, you will hear more in the following month, but we just completed the IFAD 10 Impact Assessment Initiative agenda, and we have lessons learned. We have lessons learned to feed the design of new projects and operations, to try to avoid listening these. I heard it was common in IFAD, but I don't think only in IFAD. We know what doesn't work. So if we know what doesn't work, why do we continue making the same mistake? And second, also it was raised by, I had this in mind by your presentation, your comment, sorry. In the last 10 years, at least since the 2008 food crisis, where the production of data by international community has increased tremendously, we hear a lot about data. And here we combine micro-level data with GIS data, and then we have opinions from experts. Yes, we have so many data, but the problem is, how do we use this data? To understand how the use of data is relevant for policy, first, we have to work together. And how do we do that? There are a variety of ways of doing it. We still don't know what's the right process to implement. What I can tell you is that recently there's been a huge project that has been financed, a multi-donor trust fund by USAID, Gates Foundation, and other donors that will see the collaboration between the Rome-based agencies, and in particular between IFAD, FAO, and the World Bank Hub is the 50 by 20 data, is the 50 by 2030, is producing better data in agriculture in 50 countries by 2030. There will be different components like the data production, and this will be led by FAO and the World Bank. To do what? To overcome what you were mentioning, maybe it was Arthur. We don't need only data on subsistence farmers. The new agriculture sector is completely changed in the last 20 years. They're not only the subsistence farmers of the past, they're a new type of farmers. And we need tools to encompass all the new reality of the agriculture sector. And this is what, I'm not promoting the project, but I think it's important because you will hear a lot. And FAO colleagues with the World Bank colleagues will collect data on smallholders. And here in IFAD, we're going to make sure that those data will be used by policymakers and inside IFAD. So thanks to everybody.